Let's talk bolters, siege warfare, and heavy Imperial Fist firepower with an overview of the big damage of the Anvil Siege Force. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more. In this video I thought we'd do a focused overview of the Anvil Siege Force, basically your way to play heavy gunline Space Marines in 10th edition. The Anvil Siege Force is meant to be the loosely Imperial Fist themed detachment within Codex Space Marines, though these days any chapter can use any detachment if they'd like to. It does seem to exemplify their way of war really quite well though, lots of focus on heavy weapons and a little bit of help at bringing down monsters and vehicles, and the overall theme of the force is making your static firepower units extra good, perhaps particularly nice in the lore for dealing with enemy fortifications or providing an all-out defense of a critical installation that can't be allowed to fall to the enemy. There's also a bit of theming around Gravis armor and bolt weapons as well, not quite so much in the rules, but definitely things that the Fists are known for. I think the formation realises its goal quite well. It genuinely does help out gunline assets, the main rule helping static units gain additional damage, and a bunch of the supporting ones giving you a few more ways to deal extra damage, and also a few clearly defensive tricks that are going to favour Marines fighting on objectives and holding the line against an oncoming enemy. Jumping into the rules themselves though, and Shield of the Imperium is the primary rule for the detachment, and in short this one gives all ranged weapons the heavy keyword, so that's +1 to hit if they're stationary, and anything that already had the heavy weapon keyword gets an additional +1 to wound benefit, again if the model remains static to trigger the bonus. Both bits are quite good I think. The +1 to hit usually means a 25% damage increase for the majority of Space Marines that hit on a 3+ going to a 2, though would bear in mind it doesn't stack enormously well with certain extra rules in the Codex. It means that you get slightly more limited gains from the Oath of Moment, given that that already gives you some pretty good hit chances, and the same with some unit rules like the 5-strike servo turret or ballistas dreadnought. I'd say perhaps the better half of the rule is probably the heavy keyword bonus to wound. If you're wounding on a 3+ and going to a 2 it's kind of fine, similar sort of gain to the standard ranged weapons there, but it does have the potential to be a lot more powerful. Say if you're wounding your target on a 5+, going to wounding them on a 4+ would effectively be an extra 50% damage for the unit, really quite nice with mid to lower strength things like Hellblasters or perhaps heavy intercessors maybe. Overall, the damage outputs buffs are definitely kind of handy and pretty powerful that you could have that on really quite a big chunk of your army, but I perhaps wouldn't underestimate the fact that giving up your movement can really limit an army in 40k. And a lot of the time, even if you are having the option of these big damage boosts, you're still going to gain more value by moving anyway, making having that rule a little bit moot. In general, in 10th edition competitive battlefields at least, terrain tends to be at least fairly dense. You're going to need to move to get lines of sight, to get range on your optimal targets. You might need to move towards objectives, or you might want your units either screening out the enemy a bit or staying safe from enemy reprisals. A lot of the time it means that even your gunline units might well need to move, unless your opponent is just rushing forward and presenting loads of targets at you, or you're playing on a very terrain light board, perhaps a bit more likely on casual tables as opposed to more competitive. It just means in theory land you could be getting +1 to wound on a whole chunk of your army for a lot of the game, but in practice this probably isn't going to happen quite as often as you might want. We'll talk about a few of the units that could really benefit from it in a little bit, but perhaps some of the best choices are going to be the units that really have quite a long range, so they can quite happily sit and shoot from far back in your deployment zone. Longer range vehicles like the Predator tank might quite like it. It's maybe particularly good for anything that fires out of line of sight, perhaps in particular the Space Marine Whirlwind, though Desolation Marines can benefit somewhat. And as mentioned, I think that the heavy keyword units are fairly standout, perhaps Last Fusel Eliminators, Hellblasters, Devastators, or the bolt rifles from the heavy intercessors or the standard intercessor squad. Finally, as mentioned, it does have some anti-synergy with things that don't have heavy and already have better hit roll rules for one reason or another, like the Ballistas Dreadnought, the 5-strike turret, or the Gladiator Lancer with its wound rerolls. It is just going to limit the impact of the core rule on those units. Moving on to stratagems next, and the Anvil Siege Force has 6 of them. For 1 CP there's Armour of Contempt as per standard, worsening enemy AP by 1 is generally good. For more unique stuff though, for 1 command point there's Battle Drill Recall, which is a battle tactic one. This one's potentially quite a powerful damage dealer, sustained hits 1 when you're shooting, and if you're static then that goes off on a 5+. I'd say it's kind of underwhelming if you're just getting sustained hits 1 for 1 CP outright. Getting it on the 5+ though is genuinely really quite nice. Definitely for bigger shooting units, maybe Centurions or a Repulsor Executioner or something, then that could be really quite nice. Though where it could get very standout is if you also had a Lieutenant or an Apothecary Biologist in the unit. That way you could get both sustained and lethal hits on a 5+, and potentially fish for them with Oath of Moment if you had that active as well. That's going to make just about any firepower unit really quite scary, maybe things like Hellblasters or even just heavy intercessors. I feel like this one's perhaps one of the better ones in the detachment, reliable extra damage output if you're static. For 2CP, Hail of Vengeance is a return fire stratagem. It triggers if one of your squad is lost as a casualty to enemy shooting, and you can only shoot back at the squad that targeted it, so you can't light up something different. In general, I'd say that 2CP is perhaps a bit pricey for this. Obviously, it's going to depend on how good your unit that is firing back is. If there's something really dangerous, then it'll be more worth it, and how good they'll be at killing the enemy target that killed one of them. If they're in a position just to delete the enemy unit in return, then that could well be worth 2CP. If they're the wrong sort of profile to damage it, then maybe not. Next up, for 2CP, we've got No Threat Too Great, and this one's a battle tactic. This one allows you to reroll wound rolls when your unit shoots at an enemy monster or vehicle. Really quite strong to put some very focused damage output on something scary. This one's going to make more of a percentage increase if you're wounding on a kind of low amount before. Say if you had Hellblasters again wounding on a 5+ against a tank, this would give them a 66% damage increase, which is kind of big. The stratagem is fairly expensive, but being a battle tactic maybe makes it a fairly good idea for captains, where getting it for free makes it a lot more palatable. For 1CP, there's an objective one called Not One Backward Step. In your command phase, you nominate one infantry unit on an objective. These guys have to remain stationary, but you get to double the OC of the unit until the end of your turn. This one's maybe a little bit boring, but is nice and simple. Basically, you'd use this if the increased objective control is going to make the difference between you scoring a primary objective or not doing so, because your opponent's got models on it as well. Often trading out command points directly for victory points is kind of big, though if it's not going to make that difference, you're just going to ignore it. I guess kind of a nice one to threaten though if your opponent is trying to take your objectives off you and can't kill all of your models. Finally, for 1CP, there's Rigid Discipline. This one's really quite a powerful fall back and deal damage type option. You trigger it at the end of the fight phase, so I guess usually you'd use this at the end of the enemy fight phase after they've locked you up. Your unit then makes a fallback move at the end of the enemy fight phase, so when it comes to your turn they'll be out of combat. They could just remain stationary and light up the enemy unit with a whole bunch of shooting, or potentially move somewhere else, shoot something and then charge something completely different, or could be used to fiddle your units around so you have more models towards an objective if there were some that were just out of it, and again that might be a way of trading command points for victory points. This one does have the restriction though that you either need to end that move either wholly within your deployment zone or within range of an objective marker. Might provide just a small incentive for your gunline units to remain sort of close to the drop zone, though I guess this might come up situationally a bit with midfield objectives too. Overall, I feel like there are some nice stratagems here. Probably my favourite one is that Battle Drill Recall for the just flat extra damage, particularly when you're static. No Threat Too Great seems fairly good, particularly if you're using a captain to get it free. And the last two are maybe a little bit situational, but both of them seem potentially powerful if your opponent's trying to overrun objectives under your control. Next up, we've got the Enhancements, and the Anvil Siege Force has 4 of them. Architect of War is 25 points, and this one's a nice simple one with the squad's leader granting ignore cover to their unit. Maybe a little bit on the expensive side at 25 points, though cover saves are really quite easy to come by in 10th edition, so it's definitely going to be helpful. For any sort of biggish gunline unit, I think this one's pretty reasonable to pick up. Fleet Commander I think is kind of interesting for 15 points. This one's a captain only one, and you can only use it once per game. It's one of those ones that's an orbital strike type thing. You put a marker on the board, your opponent has a turn to move out the way, and then you draw a 12-inch line out from the marker, and every enemy unit on the line suffers D3 mortal wounds on a 3+. I'd say it's probably one of those rules that's rarely ever going to be the biggest deal in the world. If your opponent's that bothered about taking D3 mortal wounds, they can usually just shift their units around so you're not taking it on more than one. I feel like for 15 points though, it doesn't have to be enormously stand out. Pretty reasonable just to throw into the middle of a big enemy formation, mean they have to do a bit of disruptive movement that they might not want to, and provided you've got something at least fairly high value to have a go at with the mortal wounds, there's at least a reasonable chance that you make your points investment back, at least in theory land. Next up, perhaps one of the easiest includes is Stoic Defender. The bearer gives his lead unit a 6+ Feel No Pain, which is just a quite nice easy durability increase, well worth the cost on bigger units there. In addition, when they get battle shocks, they halve their objective control rather than reducing it to 0, which again is handy. I'd consider the Feel No Pain perhaps the primary bonus though. Finally, for 20 points, there's Indomitable Fury. A Gravis character has a 2+ chance to resurrect with 4 wounds remaining the first time that they're slain in game. This one seems good enough to justify on a Gravis captain who knows they're going to be playing fairly aggressive with a unit of aggressors. Getting the captain to stand back up when he dies the first time I think is at least fairly powerful. With their half damage they are at least fairly tough to kill, and do have some pretty solid damage output too. If it's a captain playing relatively safe though, then it might be a little bit more questionable, as it only really has value if the squad actually dies. Overall, I feel out of these, probably the force multiplier ones are probably the most interesting. Stoic Defender seems really nice for 15 points, Architect of War seems fairly usable at 25. I'd say the other two are kind of fine, just very dependent on taking the exact models to use them. Both of them are ones that you only really ever want to use on captains, which means that you probably don't want both. And perhaps for the Fleet Commander one, it has to be a captain that you don't want Architect of War or Stoic Defender on more. Moving on to units that can perhaps make some of the best use of all of these rules though. First up, I feel like the Hellblaster squad feels like it has a very good home in this detachment. It's 125 points per 5 Space Marines with the Plasma Incinerators. They have the heavy keyword and fire out 2 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 when overcharged, all at 24-inch range. They also have their useful rule for firing in death as well, which definitely helps out to enemy counterattacks. The heavy keyword seems pretty nice given the +1 to wound that they can potentially get from it. That does kind of depend on the opponent leaving them alive within 24 inches of something important though. You probably need to make sure that you had multiple threats that your opponent had to deal with. They feel like they could be quite a solid boost for either a captain or lieutenant to lead them though. Maybe the captain to allow them some full rerolls against tanks and vehicles and things for 0 CP, or the lieutenant for lethal hits, particularly with aim to use that stratagem for lethal and critical hits on a 5+. Otherwise, both flavours of Intercessor seem rather good with the formation, the heavy Intercessors perhaps particularly for 105 points for 5 of them. The longer range and good defence means that they're a unit that could often just be left in line of sight and happily shoot off multiple times over the course of the game. The heavy bolt rifles hitting on a 2+ with strength 5 and +1 to wound seems very nice, plus they get the heavy bolter as well. Definitely a very strong unit for this detachment, given that they've already got good durability, and this one actually makes their damage kind of meaningful at longer range. The standard Intercessor squad might not be too far behind, maybe a little bit more balanced as they trade a little bit of raw hitting power with the heavy bolter for an actually fairly scary weapon on the sergeant, plus they do get a grenade launcher thrown in with a bit more strength and AP. The Eliminators also seem like a very good fit for the detachment, 75 points for 3 of them, and they can start up the board. They get the heavy keywords to hit on a 2+ with their last fusils or the bolt snipers, devastating wounds if they're static as well, so even more incentive there. And I feel like the mid-strength last fusils at strength 9 perhaps particularly like the +1 to wounds. In theory you could still be doing some movement shenanigans with them as well. Give 2 of them last fusils and 1 instigator bolt carbine. You might be able to fight the enemy while stationary and then still get 6-inch movement after that if you'd like. The Devastator squads are 120 points for the 5 with the heavy weapons. Again, they feel like a fairly good fit with longer range weapons with the heavy keyword, so +1 to hit and wound when they stay still. They also get ignores cover when they're static as a benefit, plus their Armorium Cherub. I feel like perhaps las cannons or plasma cannons could both be kind of interesting here. The Whirlwind with its indirect fire is perhaps the single most guaranteed unit to make good use of the detachment rule. Gaining the heavy keyword on the Vengeance launcher means it's going to be hitting on a 3+ despite the barrage penalty. Really quite nice, and if you needed yet more indirect fire you could use 1 CP to get the sustained hits on a 5+. Between all that you could actually have some fairly punchy indirect there. And finally, the vast majority of longer range tanks and vehicles are pretty effective here. In general, the units that don't have additional rules that buff their hit roll somehow might get a bit more benefit from the detachment. I think the Predator Annihilator is a pretty reasonable fit for that. Having those last cannons hit on a 2+ is pretty reliable increases in damage, and compared with outside of the formation it will gain a bit on the Lancer here compared with otherwise. Otherwise, due to the enhancements and the stratagems, I feel like captains and lieutenants are going to be some of the more interesting characters to lead the forces. Maybe a librarian could be kind of interesting in something like Hellblaster squad, giving them a little bit more durability to hopefully survive in the open, to open fire with the heavy keyword. Pretty much any good gunline unit is going to be a little bit better here though, just due to the core rule. I would say though that even if it might be tempting, you don't really want to invest the entire points cost into nothing but firepower units. You might be able to win direct engagements fairly well, but overall it might still not be the best thing for fighting the mission overall. I think it's definitely going to have some value to have some units to infiltrate forward, jump around doing secondary objectives and things, and actually take the fight to the enemy for things that you can't see directly with your forces. I'd say for the most part this one maybe doesn't have quite as much synergy with most of the chapter units, given that quite a lot of them tend to be a bit more melee or close range focus as opposed to long range shooting. I guess Dark Angel's Hellblasters would work quite well, Space Wolf's Longfangs generally would enjoy. I feel like Death Watch, while they have quite a lot of firepower, generally want to be shooting at close range and often shooting on the move or doing teleport things. Though as well as the Imperial Fist type characters, there's plenty of other ranged support characters out there, perhaps Chief Librarian Tigurius, Ironfather Phyros, or Vulcan Hestana, all kind of interesting. They each help out gunline armies in their own way. Finally, just to round up, I thought it could be interesting to take a look at one idea for an army list and what it might potentially look like. Again, this one's not really supposed to be absolutely top tier optimized or anything like that, but just throwing together a whole bunch of units that are at least fairly effective in the formation for an idea of how it might work in practice. First up, there's a Primaris Lieutenant with the Ignored Cover enhancement with a squad of 10 Hellblasters. They might either foot slog or start in the Repulsor depending on the opponent. Perhaps depends if it actually looks like they could survive to deal some firepower with the heavy keyword with +1 to wound, but if not, it's going to be more sensible just to make sure that they get the Alpha Strike, and the Repulsor could also help them keep safe if countercharged. It could also be a fairly good unit in its own right to use the sustained hits if stationary stratagem if you do it in more anti-horde. There's then a Captain in Terminator armor with a 6+ Feel No Pain type enhancement. That one goes on a squad of 5 Terminators with some Cyclone missile launchers. They'd aim to be a deep strike threat, and he can use his battle tactics for rerolls against vehicles, or again just another copy of sustained hits if it doesn't make more sense to save for Armor of Contempt. For some infiltration threats, there's 3 units of 3 Eliminators, all with las fusils. They're both cheap enough at 75 points to use as screens to start forward, but they could potentially be used as damage dealers as well. +1 to wound las fusils with devastating wounds as well. Hitting on 2s could be genuinely quite scary when there's 9 of them, and it seems quite nice for 225 points. For some more backfield firepower, there's a unit of Devastators with las cannons, a Gladiator Lancer which might be able to be a bit more effective on the move as things are going to have to from time to time, and then 2 units of 5 Heavy Intercessors as well. They could provide a bit more durability on a home field objective. One squad could potentially push up to a midfield one if needed. For jumping around doing secondary objectives, there's 2 units of 5 Jump Intercessors, which could also hopefully provide a small countercharge threat to bully lighter enemy infantry getting close. And finally, lurking behind the line somewhere, there's a couple of Space Marine Whirlwinds. They'll both be hitting on a 3+, and they do provide some fairly scary ignored line of sight fire support. Between the two of them, you've got at least a reasonable chance of wiping out a 5-man Space Marine squad, becoming more reliable if there's either Oath of Moment or you spring for the sustained hit stratagem on one. Overall should hopefully have enough firepower to discourage the enemy just from running straight out at the force. There are some units to rapid ingress or take the fight to the enemy if they're hiding, and they can be supported by the Whirlwinds as well, to punish the single most important thing that the opponent has chosen to hide from the rest of the guns. Let me know your thoughts anyway. What would you be most tempted to run with the Anvil Siege Force? Overall, I'd say that the formation does look kind of interesting. Both the stratagems and the detachment rule are fairly powerful, though I do feel like giving up movement for quite a lot of their best options is going to be problematic against some armies and on fairly dense tables. My first guess would be that it's probably not going to be one of the single most competitive ways to play Space Marines, but I feel like there's enough strength around to build around it. It doesn't feel quite as limited as some of the detachments out there. Look forward to hearing what you make of it down in the comments below though. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new stuff just about every day, and feel free to check out my reviews of the other Space Marine detachments from the Codex. I'll leave those links down in the video description. Finally, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can keep these videos coming quite so regularly, with new ones out every day. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.